couple of quick announcements before I let Teresa get started. Our presentation from Teresa is being live streamed on the library's YouTube channel. If you're joining us on Zoom, please remember to keep your microphone and your video off during the presentation. If you can't stay with us for the whole presentation, that's no problem. After the event is over, a recording will be available on our YouTube channel. If you are watching this event on YouTube Live, feel free to type any questions you have into the comments section of the video. I'll be monitoring this and will ensure that Teresa gets your questions for the question and answer period. If you are on Zoom, you can also type any questions you have into the chat area. After our question and answer with Teresa, we will be ending the live feed and I will show our participants on Zoom how to do our craft. And so without further ado, I will turn the presentation over to Teresa.
Thank you, Kelly. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint. Here we go. And slideshow. There we are. Okay. Can everyone see that? Yeah? All right. So my name is Teresa and I've been a Master Gardener with the Thompson Shuswap Master Gardeners I've been a certified Master Gardener for 3 years, which means I did my training 5 years ago. And one of the specialties that I like to speak about is small space gardening. And that's because I have to be a small space gardener. This is actually a picture of one of the raised beds in my backyard. I live downtown, nice sunny downtown, but the sun is blocked by my house. And so I have an allotment over on River Street. And so I'm going to talk about how to get the most out of a small space. And we'll talk about raised beds and containers and soil. And I'll show you some of the fruit of our labor. So here we go. The most important thing, of course, is location, and that's why I have to garden over at the River Street Community Garden. If you are gardening at your home, you have to choose your site really carefully because most vegetables require a lot of sun. And certainly if you're going to grow any fruit that's of any quality, you need lots of sun as well. Without adequate sun, plants are more susceptible to disease and they don't produce as well, and they can sometimes grow kind of leggy and just unhealthy. But there are certain plants that you can grow in a little bit more shade. This is a list. It's basically anything that grows in the ground, so roots, and anything that is green, so onions, kale, lettuce, spinach, beans, and peas as well. So again, it's mostly anything that grows in the ground, like carrots, or anything that's the part we eat is green. So why do we garden with raised beds? Well, raised beds are great for containing the soil, so that if you're just going to amend your soil in one area, then you can contain it. They're great for avoiding compaction. They provide better drainage. They serve as a barrier to pests, which is true, but they also, depending on what you use to make your raised bed, they can provide a place where slugs and snails can hide. So you have to be careful about that. Usually gardeners plant earlier because the raised bed tends to warm the soil better. So I'm going to show you some examples of raised beds. And the difference between a raised bed and a container is that a raised bed is open on the bottom, whereas a container is self-contained. So the advantage of raised beds over containers is that the plants have access to the soil underneath, and they also have better access to the mycorrhizal fungi. And I can talk about that more later. So here we go. This is actually a picture of my garden plot over at the allotment. I gardened in this spot for 2 years and then I switched places. And so it is contained with untreated wood. Those beds are 3 feet wide and about 12 feet long. You can buy material for raised beds. You can buy vinyl beds. Vinyl is really expensive. Something like this would probably cost you $100, which is a lot of money. You can build your own raised beds. You can use found materials such as logs, or you can use untreated timber. And the one on the lower portion of the screen shows beds that aren't even joined together. They're just held in place with rebar. This is a vertical raised bed. I don't think I would bother with this. It's meshed together with wire. The reason I wouldn't bother with this is it provides many, many places for insects to hide, not necessarily the good guys, and it looks really labor intensive. Personally, I think I would just not use a raised bed at all, just garden right in the soil in this instance, or do what I do in the new section of the allotment, is that I pile the soil up so that the paths are a bit lower, but I don't contain the soil. This is another example of a raised bed that you can build. What's awesome about this one is you can sit on the side and relax, or just sit if you have mobility issues and kind of lean over and into your garden. Again, logs and the weaving, interesting idea. Again, I'm sure it's fairly expensive. I didn't cost that one. These are fairly popular. These are galvanized steel tabs, and I actually think I have this slide in the wrong place because these would be containers. They would not be open on the bottom, but these are popular right now. And I don't know if you ever go over to Home Depot or Home Hardware, I should say. Right next to Home Hardware, there's a little area called Grow a Row, and it's a community garden where people grow for the food bank. And they are trialing many, many different kinds of raised beds in that area. So if you have a chance, you can go down there and walk and look around and just get some ideas. This is another example of a galvanized containment system, but this one would be a raised bed because it would not be open on the bottom. The sides get hot, but the heat doesn't penetrate into the soil very far. But you need to be aware when you're gardening around these that bare skin could be an ouch. These are really popular as well. These are cinder blocks, but the next slide is going to give you a caution about cinder blocks. In the manufacturing process, they can contain a substance known as fly ash, which is a byproduct of the firing of the cinder blocks, and it can leach into your soil. So it's probably not a good idea to contain your beds with cinder blocks. Just like we don't generally use treated wood, although the wood that's treated now is less toxic than it was a while ago. So I'm talking about the pressure treated timbers that you can buy, and they're less toxic now than they were. They don't have arsenic in them anymore as they used to. But if you're a true organic gardener, you would probably avoid using those as well. Here's your ultimate raised bed, complete with, it's almost like a greenhouse, right? It's got sides on it and a back, and you can open and close it on hot days. It's kind of like the ultimate. So then we can talk about containing your plants. So if you live in an apartment, or you live in a condominium where you are not allowed to garden in the grounds, then you really don't have a choice. You have to use containers. Some of the good things about containers you can see there, the one I like the most is they can be moved around to catch the sun depending on the season, because the sun is in different places in our yards at different times. So that's something to consider. They can also be dragged into a garage if you have something in them that's not hardy in our zone. You could haul it into your garage and you can keep it in there. You can get really creative with them too. Some of the disadvantages though, because they generally have a smaller amount of soil, they can be challenging to water for sure. They may need more fertilizer depending on the soil that you use. And they're more prone to compaction. And I'll talk about that in a minute. I have discovered recently a recipe for soil thanks to another master gardener. And this recipe for soil that you can use in containers, you can use over and over for 3 or 4 years, and it doesn't compact. It's actually quite amazing. So there's some of the advantages and disadvantages of containers. The next few slides will show you some containers, and I'll sort of give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. These are really popular right now. They're called veg trucks, and you can get them all over the place. This is from Home Hardware online, this slide. You can get them at Home Depot, at Costco, all sorts of places, on Amazon, of course. The good thing about this is that it has a deep center, so the vegetables have a good root zone. I also really like that it has a zipper top. They're kind of neat. So you can start things early, and you can extend your season as well. So if you plant a fall crop of lettuce or spinach, you can take it probably right into end of October in something like this. They do require more water, and the water does leak out the bottom. So that's a kind of a negative thing. I first saw these at the Seattle flower show about 5 years ago. They're made in Australia. These are awesome. The advantage from these over the veg truck in the previous slide is that these ones have a self-watering system in the bottom. So if you have to go away for a day or two, you can fill up the reservoir with water, and it will water itself for a couple of days. So that's kind of a cool thing. They also come on stands you can get wheels for these stands, so you can wheel them around on your deck or patio. I think this is probably my favorite. These are really popular right now. Anything that grows in a bag, it's kind of a heavy duty felt type material that will last a few years. I actually haven't tried these, but I know they're really popular right now. This one unfolds to make a raised bed, but you can also get them in smaller sizes for individual plants. The black one, I believe, is from Canadian Tire. The gray one is maybe from Walmart. I forgot to put the links underneath for those. The red tomato ones, let me see if this one here is from Lee Valley, the red tomato. And then this is an interesting idea, the rows of potting soil bags. I've seen this, my next door neighbor actually did this last year. She just cut holes in the bag and put it in the sunniest part of her yard, which happened to be a sloping driveway. So she just tucked them right up against the house and grew squash in them. And the squash, of course, grew out into the driveway where it was nice and warm, and was a bit of an issue, but it was a fun problem to have. The downside of this is you have to poke a lot of holes in the bottom of it to provide adequate drainage. Now, in this picture, it looks as though it's inside of a greenhouse or a sheltered area, so you wouldn't have to worry about the rain so much. And of course, in Kamloops, we don't get very much rain, but we do have rain events, although we haven't had one yet this year. But we can have times when it will rain really a lot. And so you have to be aware of providing drainage in the bottom of those. When I look at this picture, though, I wonder to myself, why would this person line up all of these bags across what looks like a decent bed to plant in? Good question. Canadian Tire sells something called Root Farm, and it can be used to grow a small amount of produce. Again, I haven't tried these, so I can't give you the pros and cons on them. I do know people like to use them for potatoes because they can put the potato in the bottom of the pot with just a little bit of soil. And then you can add soil as the potato grows, which is the equivalent of heaping up the soil around your potatoes. And because it's in a container, you could actually have this on your balcony. I don't know if you've heard of Gardener's World. It's television. It's a BritBox television series with Monty Don, the famous gardener in England. He's doing some trialing of these right now. So I'll let you know how they go. This is made by the same company as the Vegepods. And this is like the ultimate container for growing a tomato. You can see the tomatoes actually inside a container in the veggie bag. And so it's like a fully climate controlled situation. You'd have the bugs not there. So you wouldn't have to worry about tomato hornworms, for example. You could also shelter your tomato from wind and so on. But unless you grow a tomato that's parthenocarpic, which means it doesn't need pollen, then you'd still have to open it up so that the bumblebees could get at this. I'll just tell you an interesting little fact about bumblebees right now. Bumblebees pollinate tomatoes, but the tomatoes have to have a certain pitch of buzz before they release their pollen to the bumblebees. And so bumblebees pitch on C when they pollinate tomatoes. It's an interesting little bit of trivia about bumblebees. Okay, now we're going to get into some containers that I don't really recommend. Lots of people like to use found objects for their containers, and the problem with this one is that it would not have adequate drainage unless you had drilled a lot of holes in the bottom of your wheelbarrow. If you provided adequate drainage and soil that would drain properly, this one would be okay. But I think other things are better. Lots of people like to take furniture, such as this piano bench, and turn it into a container. It's kind of funky. They're growing lettuce in this container, which might work if you live in a really rainy part of the country. I think it would have to be even rainier than Vancouver. So say maybe Prince Rupert, because this would dry out really quickly. You'd have to water this several times a day in Kamloops. And everybody knows what happens to lettuce when it dries out. It gets really bitter so that you can't even eat it. So I do not recommend furniture as a container for growing vegetables or even flowers, really. This is a toolbox. You know, it kind of would work for succulents as long as, again, you had adequate drainage holes in the bottom and you use a soil that would work for succulents. So the drain in the bathtub, where the water goes out when it's in your house, is not enough drainage for growing flowers or vegetables for that matter. And again, it's because if we have a rain event, it would fill up and things could go rotten pretty quickly. The problem with this kind of thing is very cute. It's actually very beautiful. I love the baskets, but they don't contain enough soil. And so the plants will dry out and they'll be stunted and so on. I used to do this before I was a master gardener and before I knew about the toxic materials in rubber tires that leach into soil. I actually had something set up like this and I grew strawberries in it. And it was very beautiful. And the strawberries loved it because it was super warm, but not healthy. Don't do that anymore. And of course, this looks awesome, but again, probably doesn't have adequate drainage, and you would need to water this in the heat of the summer probably 3 times a day. And who wants to do that? So good soil is probably the most important part about growing in small spaces, whether you're growing in raised beds or whether you're growing in containers. So this is the recipe I was telling you about that I got from a fellow master gardener. She's been doing this for years and I'm doing it now. And I tried it last year for the first time. And I don't know if you have grown in containers before, but in the spring, if you leave your soil in your container all winter, and usually we do, and we tend to leave the dead plants in it too. And then it's hard as a rock in the spring and you have to chisel out the roots and the soil is just not nice to grow in. So sometimes what we do is we scoop off the top part of the soil and then we add new soil, which is one solution for sure. But this recipe is such that in the springtime, the plants just pull out and the dirt shakes free from the roots. You can actually take a trowel or even just your fingers and fluff it up, add a little bit more fertilizer, maybe a little bit more worm castings, and you're good to go. So my friend uses the same amount of coconut core and worm castings, but I've used slightly less worm castings. You can buy the coconut core and the worm castings at garden centers. You can also get them at hydroponic garden centers in larger quantities. So it's 1 part coconut core, 1 part worm castings, and 1 part that's a mixture of vermiculite and perlite. And that is the sort of the base of the soil. Then to that amount, you would add about 1 liter of alfalfa pellets or alfalfa meal. And you can get alfalfa pellets at PV Mart. They are basically horse food. So you add that, and then about 1/2 liter of kelp meal. So that's a granular product. And then you need to add some fertilizer. So I recommend Gaia Green all-purpose fertilizer. You definitely do not want to use anything over a rating of 5 for the NPK, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and the potash. You don't want to use more than 5 in a container because you can burn the roots. So if you're growing flowers, I would recommend Gaia More Bloom. And if you're growing veg, I would recommend Gaia Green. And then you need a handful of rock dust. So there's lots of different kinds of rock dust, but that adds the minerals that the plants will need. The kelp meal adds a fair amount of trace minerals as well. And then I wet it down really well and I leave it overnight. And in the morning, just stick it in your containers and you are ready to plant. This slide just shows what's in potting soil when you purchase it. And there are lots of different kinds of potting soil. And you can get it already with fertilizer in it, although it's not likely to be organic fertilizer. But you can ask for advice at a garden center. And I have used Pro Mix, that's quite nice. In my flower pots, I have used Miracle Grow, which isn't organic because it's, they use chemical fertilizers, but for flowers, I've done that from time to time. And you can get all kinds of things. It's good if you can to stay away from peat-based soils, simply because peat is a non-renewable resource. Now, the coconut core comes from the other side of the world, so it's using non-renewable energy, which is an issue, but I think it's better than using peat. Plus, peat compacts hard as a rock, whereas the coconut core doesn't. And this is a please, whatever you do not buy soils that are recommended for containers that have water-saving gels in them. The idea with these gels is that they puff up with water and then they slowly release the water into the soil. But the unfortunate thing about them is they contain substances which are harmful to human health and toxic actually to aquatic organisms. So how would aquatic organisms come in contact with this if you're using it for your flower pots? Well, do you empty your flower pots into your garden? I do. When the soil is spent, I add it to my garden. Just to give it the nice body. And so the rain then would wash it into the ground and it could potentially get into the groundwater system. So avoid those. And you can also buy these soils anywhere and they're advertised as best for containers. So what do you feed your containers? Well, if you are using a soil recipe that you're making yourself, you probably don't need to feed them anything for the first year, although vegetables are hungry. And so if you're growing veg in your containers, you may need to do some top dressing. And so that's where you put compost or vermicompost on the top of the soil. And you can sort of scratch it in a bit, or just leave it right on the top and water through it. 2 liquid treatments I recommend are liquid seaweed and fish emulsion. The thing about liquid seaweed, it's a little bit controversial right now because of the fact it's made from kelp, and kelp is the forest of the sea. So you have to be careful that you source it from somewhere that is not cutting the kelp at too high a rate. So these are available. There's the Gaia Green I was telling you about. That's available at Art Naps. It's also available lots of places. Kelp Man is a BC sourced. It's available at West Coast Seeds, and I did see it at Art Naps this year as well. So these are liquid feeds. You mix them with water, you pour them over the plants, and it's actually beneficial to actually pour them onto the plants so that the leaves come in contact with these fertilizers as well. That's what's in it. And you can see a lot of the things in that are in the soil that, that I make. The only thing that I would say that you don't need to add in any huge amount to your garden for sure, and especially not to your containers, is bone meal. It's a myth that our soils, so our native soils, are low in calcium. And the reason tomatoes get blossom end rot is because they're not getting enough calcium, but it's not because the calcium isn't there. It's because tomatoes require consistently moist soil, and the plants are not able to access the calcium unless the soil is moist. So when your tomatoes go wet, dry, they develop a condition known as blossom end rot. And it's a nasty spot on the end of the tomato, which makes it quite unappealing. So the way to keep your tomatoes evenly moist is to mulch them. Put some straw on them or some compost or something to keep the soil evenly moist. And water deeply. Okay, so there are specialty seeds for container gardening and for small space gardening. And these are generally dwarf, and they'll be advertised as, or they'll be labeled as dwarf or compact. But the neat thing about these varieties is they actually produce full-size fruit or full-size vegetables. So I'm going to show you now some things that I have tried that I've found great success with. That little zucchini grows full-size zucchinis, and the plant stays compact. It gets bigger than it shows in that picture, but it stays quite compact. This little cucumber on the right called Piccolino, that has been an amazing cucumber. And you know those cucumbers, the mini cucumbers that you buy at Costco or Safeway or any grocery store, those are actually not immature cucumbers. Those are a special kind of cucumber called a Bayet alpha cucumber, of which Piccolino is one. And so it's full size when it's that size. The plants are fairly compact as well. You know how cucumbers can go forever and ever. These ones tend to go about 1.5 meters. And then they are mature. Patio Star tomato, it's a little bit bigger than a cherry tomato, but not a lot. Silet's tomato is a compact plant, so it doesn't require a lot of staking. However, I actually recommend staking tomatoes in your small space garden, and I'll show you some slides on that in a minute. Juliet Tomato is an amazingly prolific tomato. It's bigger than a cherry tomato. Again, it's sort of oval shaped jumbo cherry. Patio Baby is a lovely little eggplant that stays compact and you can tuck it in. It's great. Mascot beans can actually be grown in a container because they really only get about 30 centimeters or a foot tall. Dwarf gray sugar snow peas, those are awesome. They can be grown on a small fence or in a pot with a trellis. Sugar snap peas, you can get forms of kale that are bush growing as opposed to monster kale, which I usually end up growing. Some of the fruits that do well in containers are things like strawberries. These yellow alpine strawberries are delicious. I have some of those in my garden. This is a variety of raspberry called raspberry shortcake, and I have this raspberry in my garden. The picture of the pot is what it looked like when I bought it, and I actually left it in the pot all winter, and I just procrastinated, and I was really upset that I did that because I figured it would not survive a Kamloops winter in a pot. But lo and behold, it did. So I planted it in my garden, and this is it right here. The plants stay about, I don't know, 40 centimeters tall, but they are covered with masses of delicious raspberries. And raspberries are one fruit that can take just a little bit less shade or less sun. So it's an initial investment to buy this variety of raspberry, but it's worth it. And they spread just like any other raspberry. Jelly bean dwarf blueberry. This is, again, a blueberry that can be grown in a container. And really in Kamloops, it's hard to grow blueberries in anything but a container because they really do like acidic soil. I've tried blueberries, but they're dying a slow death, and I'm letting them. So the other thing besides the soil and the container and the seeds is how you're going to support your plants. And I say think vertically. So I have some examples here of different ways of supporting plants. This is somebody who has just taken a piece of a closet organizer, I think, and tied it to some wooden stakes. And that will make a totally fine trellis for growing peas or beans or cucumbers or squash, so long as it's anchored into the ground really well. This is an A-frame made with PVC. Yeah, basically it would be good, again, as long as it's anchored into the ground. And as you can see, it's just sitting on top of the soil, and one Kamloops wind and it would just fall over. There are lots of other ways of using PVC, and I'll show you. I think I have a slide coming up. This is a cattle panel, and this is something that's catching on too. And you can buy cattle panels at the horse barn, or no, at Agri Supply, I believe, and probably at the horse barn. And you just, it comes in that length, and you simply bend it over and anchor it to some steel stakes or some kind of stake that is in the ground. And then you can use it to grow anything on. And what's neat about this is if you have two small beds that are side by side, you can grow it up and over from one bed to the other. And so it becomes a tunnel. And it's very satisfying to pick beans inside a bean tunnel in the summer. It's nice and cool and shady and really fun. This is a garden at the allotment where I garden. And this person has used PVC pipe. And this is a good way to anchor it because there's rebar in the ground. And the PVC pipe, half-inch PVC, fits nicely onto the rebar. And then she's reinforced the top. And then she's put like a plastic kind of fencing over it so that things will grow on it. PVC is plastic. Some people don't like to use anything plastic. They would just use wood. But the gardener that owns this particular trellis assures me that she intends to use it forever. And it's been in her plot since 2013. So it's doing really well. She grows squash on it, peas, beans, you name it. So this is back to my garden. I wanted to show you again. So this is the garden in early spring. Underneath of the row cover, I have carrots growing or starting. And underneath of this piece of poly, I think I was warming the soil so that I could plant peas and beans. But the reason I'm showing you this slide again is because the next few slides show you what this garden looks like in June. So there it is. That's the same garden. On the back fence, I have peas growing up. On the side trellis, I have a variety of tomato that's gigantic. On the little green trellis, I have cucumbers that are just getting going. Down the middle, you can see the kale and the kohlrabi and the leeks at the back. Strawberries on the left. Here's another slide. Same garden. Beans, the peas came out, the beans went in. I think that's why it looks different. Or, yeah, and then there's peppers in there. And this is in the other side of it. There were two beds. So this one's over on the right. And those are beets that are intensely cropped. And yeah, so you can get a lot of produce out of a small space. I was telling you about that tomato. It's a variety called Sicilian saucer, and it was just growing on that trellis. Those little cucumbers, that is a large steel bowl, and that was one day's pick. Those are leeks and peppers that are grown in that same allotment. And then last year I moved to a different garden, but the same River Street City Garden, community garden, but I moved to a different plot. And so this is just an early spring picture showing arugula and lettuce that are intensely cropped. So this is the same garden. That's a picture of beans growing up a trellis, and I was astounded at the number of beans that I grew in the allotment. This is this year. Well, the garlic picture is this year. So the green garlic growing is this year. This is last year's garlic harvest. And so you can see how much garlic grows, and it's pretty intensely planted. So here are the 4 things, just to recap, that are the most important. The site, that's probably number 1, because it's sun that makes a garden grow. The second thing is the soil. And if you are using containers, make sure you use a soil that's specially blended for containers. If you are growing in the ground, it's always a good idea to amend your soil as well. The seeds, look for the small varieties, and support. And the last slide I want to show you, it's just a little laugh because it says, and don't forget to consider espalier along your fence. So I'm going to show you a picture of my pear tree that I have growing along my fence. That's last year's pears, and they were yummy. So that's my new allotment last summer. And you can see the size of the kale, and everything is really happy and healthy. I just wanted to put a little plug in here for Master Gardeners, and you can see our email address if you have questions. I'm actually the Master Gardener who is taking over the question answering and trying to answer questions in a more timely fashion. I was going to say, I don't generally check it on the weekends though. So if you send me a question this weekend, you probably won't get an answer till Monday. Anyway, that's my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint, and I would love to answer your questions. There we go. Kelly, were you going to read the questions, or shall I just look at them? I'll just see here.
Jennifer had a question there.
Jennifer asked if it's okay to use cedar. Are you, for your beds? Yes, for sure. As a mulch, not so much. Cedar as a mulch inhibits growth, but so if you want to use it in your pathways between your beds, that's great. And if you want to use it to enclose your beds, that's good too. Yeah, people use cedar because it's very slow to decompose, so it makes an awesome material for raised beds. Anybody else have any questions?
What do you recommend as a mulch, a good mulch?
Chopped straw. That's my favorite.
Right.
But it's good to use bark mulch between the paths because the mycorrhizal fungi feed on the bark. They feed on high carbon materials, so they really like woody materials. Yeah. But if you recall that slide where I showed the garlic, I am mulching my garden this year permanently with straw, and I use chopped straw. It's called, I think it's called dust extracted straw. I get it at PV Mart. It goes on sale for about $10 a bale. It takes one bale to do my whole veg garden at the allotment.
Right.
Yeah. I'm also experimenting this year with something, it's my second year now actually, with something called no-dig gardening. And if anybody wants to find out about that, they should look up Charles Dowding, Dowding. He's sort of the gardener who brought it into, he kind of helped to popularize it. He has a blog and a website, and he teaches classes and courses. And no dig is catching on around the world, and it's catching on for agricultural growing as well as backyard gardening. So it's cool.
And what does that mean? No dig?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I was going to talk about that. No dig is where you don't dig. You add your soil amendments to the surface of the soil. So in the fall actually is the best time. You add compost to your soil. So you could make your own compost and add that to the surface, or you could add some worm castings, or you could use sea soil. I don't know if the viewers have heard of sea soil. You want the original sea soil. It's a mix of fir bark that's composted with fish remains. And it's a really nice, rich, organic amendment. But with no dig gardening, you just lay it on the surface. And then when you plant, you actually, to plant your peas or beans, you take a dibble and you just poke a hole and drop your seed in. Then gently close a hole with your fingers. So you dig as little as possible. It's fabulous because it's a lot of work digging. And it's a myth that vegetables like to grow in soft, fluffy soil. Lots of gardeners really, well, tilling your soil is bad for your soil. But even turning your soil over with a shovel is not healthy for your soil.
Oh, I thought you were supposed to do that.
I know, most people do. And if you're initially putting in a bed and you have, you want to till in some cover crop or something to help improve the soil, or you're trying to get rid of an insect pest or something, then turning over the soil with a spade is just something you have to do. But once you've done that initially, you don't have to keep doing it year after year. And when you do it year after year, you break up the mycorrhizal fungi threads. So those are called mycelium. And if you ever dig in your soil and you see all these white threads that are kind of connected together and you think, oh, what's that strange looking stuff? That's actually a good thing, because mycorrhizal fungi have a relationship with plant roots where they bring nutrients to the plants from around the garden, and the plants in turn provide sugars to the fungus. So they have this mutually beneficial arrangement. And when you dig up your soil, you break those threads.
Right.
So it's kind of cool, and I'm really enjoying learning about it and trialing no dig gardening.
So how often should you till your garden?
Never.
Never.
No.
Interesting.
No.
Okay.
That's a kind of a remnant of agricultural farming, the idea that we need to till soil.
Right.
What happens when you till is you actually compact the soil below the depth that the tiller reaches. So if you can imagine the tiller's going round and round, and it's actually pounding the ground. It's loosening up the soil above, but below where it reaches, it's compacting it. And then if you have any kind of a perennial weed, it's going to chop it all up and spread it all around, and it's going to upset the earthworms and break up the structure of the soil. So tilling is not good for your soil. Yeah.
Wow.
What are your thoughts about no weeding gardens by planting vegetable seeds in bales of hay? You know, I haven't tried the straw bale gardening. I would stay away from hay if I were you. Straw should be fine. The reason I would stay away from hay is that hay, particularly hay that's fed to horses, so Timothy hay, is often treated with a herbicide that that they use to kill weeds. And so you can be introducing that to your soil. What I have had this problem. I'm stalling here trying to remember the name of the herbicide, but things like Tordon and so on can end up in the hay, and particularly in manure of horses that have eaten this hay, and then that will stunt your plants. They will germinate but not grow, or they might grow and be all kind of oddly shaped, and that's a result of herbicides that have been sprayed on hay crops. They don't seem to do it with straw so much. So I've actually never tried the straw bale planting, but if you've got the space, I don't see why you couldn't make a bed with straw, and will take a lot of soil to fill it up. But, you know, go for it. Planting right in the bale of hay, I haven't tried that. I would be a little bit concerned about the amount of soil that would be available to the plants. Eventually their roots would work their way right through the straw, but initially they would be kind of limited in the amount of nutrients and so on because of a fairly small amount of soil going into the straw. Which seed company? I get all my seeds from 2 seed companies, West Coast Seeds, and West Coast Seeds have seed displays at local garden centers, and they're a BC company, and that's where I got Piccolino, the cucumber, and Patio Baby, and that's the eggplant, and most of my seeds. I also buy seeds from a company in Ontario called William Dam. Both of those are seed companies that I use. I try to go with West Coast Seeds though, because they're local and they're organic, so it's good. Yeah, heirloom seeds are non-GMO. Yes. Yeah. What makes an heirloom seed isn't just the age, it's the fact that it's open pollinated. So that means that that tomato that you save the seeds from will produce the same tomato next year. Whereas if you use a hybrid, particularly an F1 hybrid, so that means it has 2 distinct different parents, you don't know your seeds what they will be like. You don't know what you'll get. So if you use an F1 bean seed, for example, you could get, it could revert back to either of the parents or some odd cross from another bean in your garden. Yeah. You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay. Well, once again, oh, here's one. Is there a place where I can get a list of which vegetables to not plant side by side? You know, that's mostly a myth that you can't plant things beside each other. Cucumbers are a little bit fussy about onions, but that whole idea of companion planting certain vegetables because they don't like other vegetables is really a myth. It's a very popular one. but you can mix it up. And in fact, if you saw my garden, it had a few beets and then some leeks and then some peppers and then some spinach and then a few more leeks. And I do that intentionally because it confuses the insects. So if you mix it up a bit, they're less likely to find the things they like to eat. If you grow a big, huge patch of carrots, you're likely to attract carrot rust flies. Carrot rust flies, by the way, are easy to prevent. There's two things you can do to prevent attracting carrot rust flies. And if everybody knows what that is, it's you pull your carrot out and it's got these black kind of tunnely bits in it. And those tunnely bits are made by a maggot that the carrot rust fly lays eggs and they hatch. And those maggots eat up your carrots. Then they turn into flies and they leave the soil. So first of all, there's a couple things you can do. One, don't ever plant your carrots in the same place 2 years in a row. 2, plant your carrots thinly so that you don't have to pull out the little carrots from the row, because carrot rust flies have an amazing sense of smell and they will be attracted to the smell of those carrots coming out of the ground. But the third thing that I do is you can cover those carrots with a row cover, a floating row cover, or you can put a low fence around them. So you can put 4 stakes in the ground around a little patch that you have of carrots, and then put some row cover, so some fabric or netting around the outside of those posts, because carrot rust flies fly really low to the ground and they don't go up higher than about 30 to 40, well, about 40 centimeters, 40 to 50 centimeters. So you don't even have to have a very high fence. It also helps to grow carrots in a raised bed, because the carrot rust flies, again, they fly close to the ground, so they won't find your carrots. Marigolds are great planted all around. I plant lots of marigolds in my garden. That last slide I showed you, that big orange flower, was a marigold. It was near the end of the season, so it had grown a lot. Marigolds do 2 things. One, they tend to repel nematodes, which is a good thing. And 2, they attract bees, which is even better. Because if you've ever had a zucchini plant that the tip of it kind of wilts and it doesn't grow, that's from lack of pollination. It sort of looks like blossom end rot, but it's lack of pollination. So if you plant lots of flowers in with your vegetables, you'll attract bees and you'll end up with vegetables that are well pollinated. Stake. What do you recommend to stake to lead vertical veggies? I'm not sure what you mean. What do you recommend? If you're talking about how do I attach them to my trellises? Yes, I think that's what you mean. I have used the veggie Velcro, and that's nice. But my favorite thing is a wire that's coated with a sponge-like material. You can buy it anywhere. It's really popular. You can even get it at the dollar store. And it's like this soft, sort of like a foam rubber, almost like a styrofoam rubber with a wire inside of it. So you can just cut it with your clippers or with scissors, and then it's nice and tender and it stays in place in the shape that you want it. Because I usually wrap my vegetables to the trellis with a figure 8. So I'll hold up a pencil. If this is the vegetable and this is the trellis, I go around this way and then back that way. And that way you can shape the wire to hold the fruit vertical, but not snugged in tight to the trellis. And even with those monster tomatoes I showed you, that's what I used. You can use lots of things though. I've seen people use strips of cotton cloth. I've seen people use Just twine. The problem with twine is it will cut into the stems a bit too much. Let's see, what else have I used? There are clips you can buy, but the clips have to be big enough to go around the plant and the stake or the trellis. So yeah, you'd have to be careful with that you're not pinching the stem of your plant. How do I naturally get my apple tree so oh, what a good question. I'm so glad you asked. I discovered the most amazing thing. And I was going to put some slides in about this, but then I thought, oh, it's not really about fruit growing. It's more about containers and beds. But if you do a search for wrapping fruit with plastic bags. So again, it's plastic and not everybody likes to use that, but you can use it over and over and over and over and over. I'm not against plastic. I'm just against single use, use it, chuck it out. So you put a slit in the top of the Ziploc part. And then about the first week of June, when the apples are about the size of a chestnut or a large marble, you slip the plastic bag over the fruit and you pinch it shut all the way to the stem. And then you need to cut 2 slits in the side of the plastic bag at the bottom in the corners. So I have them in my kitchen drawer because I use them over and over. But if the bag is, I haven't got a piece of paper even. Let me see here. What can I use? Okay. Okay, so here's your plastic bag. You cut a fairly large notch off the corner in the bottom, like so. And then you open up the Ziploc part and you slice through one part of it. So just the front or the back of it, but you don't need to slice through both, just through one. And then you put this up and over your apple and you zip it shut right to the stem on both sides. And the apples grow in there beautifully. And it was phenomenal. It was just so successful. And I had a huge codling moth problem with my apples because I had a neighbor with an apple tree that didn't spray. And then they found my tree. And it was quite interesting to watch them because I have all these little bags on my apples and this cloud of moths. They can smell them, but they can't find them. And they don't find the slits in the bottom of the bag because of the way they lay their eggs. They lay on a twig, they land on a twig or a leaf, and they crawl down till they find the apple, and then they go in that way. So it was brilliant. Okay. I think you're probably looking forward to getting on to making your macrame herb planter. Be good.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Teresa.
Okay, so once again, I'll just put in a plug for the Master Gardeners again. Our email address, if you have questions you want to ask, is TS, so Thompson Shuswap, but just the letters, TS Master Gardeners, plural, @gmail.com. I'll type it in to the chat. TS Master Gardeners @gmail.com. There we go. Okay, here it comes. Good. It says privately though. I don't know, Kelly, maybe you can share that with everyone. It says I shared it privately.
Oh, okay.
Oh, here. I'll go everyone in the meeting. There we go.
Okay.
Master Gardeners @gmail. been a pleasure talking with you. And if you want to get more ideas, it's always nice to go and visit a community garden and just peek through the fence and see what all the gardeners are doing. And happy gardening, everyone. And I hope you have great success this year. Brace yourself, though. It's supposed to be 29 degrees this weekend, and those baby cucumbers are not going to appreciate that.
Oh.
Okay.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you to everyone who joined us on YouTube. I'm going to be ending the live stream now, and the remainder of this event will be entirely on Zoom. Before we go, I want to let everyone know about some upcoming programs that may be of interest. Next week on May 20th, join us to hear from acclaimed Vancouver author Robin Stevenson. Robin is the award-winning author of more than 25 books of fiction and nonfiction, and will be speaking about the classifications and categories of children's literature and tips for writing and publishing in each. On June 3rd, we have our final author talk for the season, featuring screenwriter and author Rosalind Muir. Rosalind will talk about the differences between writing for film and writing fiction. Both these events can be watched on Zoom or on YouTube Live, and a recording will be posted to our YouTube channel after the events. Thanks again for joining us, and as always, if you have any questions, please reach out to the library at questions@tnrd.ca, call us at 250-372-5145, or send us a message on Facebook.